no matter what you do in a relationship, someone's going to leave one way or another. Someone's going to die. Like it's, unless you're like lucky and you like, I don't know, you're on the Ferris wheel together and it bursts into flames. You both die instantaneously together in love, which is beautiful. It's the way everyone wants to go, burning to death on the Ferris wheel on Valentine's Day. But it doesn't always go that way. It usually doesn't.
Welcome to Horror Business. Today, our special guest is an author I've had the pleasure of working with for many years and the privilege of calling a friend. Kristopher Triana joins us today to discuss how he successfully navigates writing across multiple genres. I guess to start off with, Chris, we've talked about on this show that labels and classifying are important, right, for the human brain, but it's also can be extremely detrimental to an author. It's a very fine line. So my first question is, let's say a random person meets you, finds out you're an author and says, hey, what do you write? What's your initial response to the genre that you write?
I write horror. Yeah. And it's a funny thing. I was talking with some other people about this fairly recently, about how actually, yeah, I was on another podcast. I was talking with Edward Lee and Rath James White and a few other people were on, and we were talking about how it's an interesting thing that horror writers have to deal with when people find out you're a writer, and then they say, what kind of stuff do you write? And you say horror. There's always these people that give you this kind of like, oh, like look, like, they get this suspicious look on. They're like, oh, there must be something wrong with this person. They write horror. But other writers of other genres don't seem to get that result. Like, even if you say, oh, I write crime, people don't go, oh, he must be a criminal. They don't do that, or I write romance. Yeah. Oh, they must be a pervert. They don't they don't do that. But with horror, they do. They're like, oh, horror, But no, I mean, it's just I guess it depends. Like if someone's coming to me as a reader and wants to know, I'll get into more detail. But in everyday life, someone finds I'm a writer, and it just depends on the situation I'm in whether or not I'm going to like to elaborate.
Right, but you evaluate very quickly. Like, okay, I don't tell them about body art first. Maybe I talk about a fine evening in hell first. Right,
yeah. It depends.
Well, then, yeah, I do. I wanted to say the same thing, that I do get that a lot. I find myself when I say horror, I get very nervous right away, and I go, oh, you know what? It's actually, I just write dark, spooky stuff. I find myself saying these silly things like crime, mystery. I throw all those in that you're talking about because I almost do feel this sense that they are judging me suddenly for horror, whereas if I said any of these other things that are very close, they wouldn't be. Yeah. I like that. I guess then, because it's really difficult to say it's just horror, because you throw in elements of other subgenres in there. So I guess my next question would be, until about like 2016, I would say everything I read from you was totally brutal. Like, it was full on horror. We started with The Devouring, and I was like, wow, this is all that this guy does, which is still great. But when you started back then, did you know that you would eventually branch out and be incorporating all these other subgenres into your horror to make it more full? Or was that just a natural evolution as you became a more skilled writer and you just started to come up with these plots?
Well, I mean, I was writing stuff, even in the early days, I was writing stuff that wasn't extreme horror. I just became known for it early on because my extreme stuff became more popular than my other stuff. Like the novel that I wrote before Body Art, which your press Bloodbound Books put out, Body Art is way splattery, way extreme and gross. The book I put out just before that, which was my first published novel, was called The Ruin Season, and it's more of a literary crime story. It's not horror, let alone extreme horror. There's no blood and guts. It's dark as hell, but there's no gore or extremity to it. So I definitely I've always written, I think, like according to what the story called for in my mind. The fact that Ruin Season and Body Art came out back to back is kind of ridiculous, because here I was just starting off and I've given people two completely different styles of books, that represent me. But it depended on what the story was. With the Ruin Season, it was something more from the heart. With Body Art, I just had a wild idea and I ran with it, and it was the type of book that couldn't be written any other way. I mean, the story is about a porn crew making the most extreme, dirty movie ever, and so of course it has to deliver that extreme content.
So when you think of these books, I think you're kind of hinting at it, but it's the story that comes first, right? Before you even think about like how it's going to present or like who you're writing to or anything like that, right?
That's exactly right. Yeah. It's the story that comes first. And then as it goes along, it's really more like once I'm finished with it, I say, okay, which publisher would this work for, and there's some where I would go right to Mark because I know he doesn't shy away from the extreme stuff, but then there are other ones that recently Bloodbound Books we have collaborated and put out some stuff that's more thriller, more mystery, but in the early days it was just gore, and there was definitely stuff that I was like, well, this is good, but I'm not going to send it to Mark because it's just not the right press for it. But Bloodbound Books has grown and changed, and I have too. And
the story is what matters most. That is
right.
important. And I feel like saying you're a horror author is correct, because I feel like even if you were to write and I don't want to say romance because that's the wrong word, because romance means something different, but you could write a love story, and you kind of have in many ways already,
mm-hmm.
But there's
Definitely.
Always the darker side. There's a story there. It's not just I don't know, it's not the romance that you focus on. So maybe when we say we're horror authors, and this is just popping into my head now, it's that we infuse that element into whatever genre we are writing. So if I write a sci-fi story, if Chris writes a sci-fi story, it's going to have that scary element in it. They're probably not just going to be time traveling to, have fun or see a past lover or something like that, and mm-hmm. just a super happy ending. It's going to have those elements of horror in it, I guess. Is that what you would say? You're always that horror author that way, no matter what?
Yeah, I think so. Not militantly, though. Not like if I have a story in mind, I don't say, okay, I've got to add horror to it. But you're right. I definitely have written stuff that is romantic, stuff about love and marriage and all that kind of stuff. But then there's also the flip side of all of that, which is divorce and widowhood and etc. That's the thing about love is just as painful as it is wonderful, in that it's not going to end well. It's kind of like when you get a pet and you're just like, okay, this is wonderful, but it's not going to end well. Like no matter what you do in a relationship, someone's going to leave one way or another. Someone's going to die. Unless you're like lucky and you like, I don't know, you're on the Ferris wheel together and it bursts into flames, you both die instantaneously together in love, which is beautiful. It's the way everyone wants to go, burning to death on the Ferris wheel on Valentine's Day, but it doesn't always go that way. It usually doesn't. So
I'm going to use that line sometime with my wife soon. I feel like, honey, I think like if we could go, let's go the way Chris said.
Go that way.
Well, that's kind of something I've been thinking about a lot too, is that just
burning to death on a Ferris wheel?
Oh, man. Kind of.
Wow.
I just was around the largest Ferris wheel, like one of the largest Ferris wheels in the world, saw it. And this is just how my mind works, where I just think of it as a horror story. Like, mm-hmm. So when when you say that, I'm like, well, like, that's kind of what crosses my mind when I see a Ferris wheel, and I see mm-hmm. and I just kind of start making up these things that will turn these like completely mundane situations into horror stories. So I'm wondering if you guys think that way too, because that just seems to be how my mind works. And if that's the first thing that you came up with when you're talking about, the tragedy of great love is burning to death on a Ferris wheel. Like, I think you guys might have that same thing.
Yeah, I think we do. Yeah. I always, like, this is like how my mind is. I've poisoned myself so much with horror, even just in entertainment, the stuff that I enjoy. It's been such a huge part of my life, to the point of obsession, that, whenever it's summer and I like go outside and I'm like, oh man, like if I go on a canoe or something, I'm thinking of slasher movies the entire time. I can't help it. I'm just, and it's in a wonderful, happy way. I'm not like scared out in the boat, like, oh no, Cropsy's gonna jump out of the water and get me. It's not that. It's just I'm just like, yeah, Cropsy, yeah, Friday the 13th, yeah, sleepaway camp. Like it's this like sickness in a way where it's like you can't get the horror stuff out of your mind. And to elaborate on what you said, Lucy, is yeah, little mundane things in life. It's like your mind just as a horror creator goes to that place of like, what if, and particularly in a carnival is already kind of a creepy, weird setting anyway. There's just something alien about that whole setting, the weird lights and the music and the creepy carnies and everything, and the rides that are a thrill because you might actually die because they were just put together with rusty bolts, like 2 hours ago, and so.
It's true. I was at Ocean City when I was a kid, and I was too small for the ride. It was like a spinning thing, and my dad had to like hold me in because it didn't seal enough to keep small kids in, and we're just like hanging on for
I think for me that's and Chris and I have talked about this. That's one of the things I want to see, those mundane things. Not that there's anything wrong with the vampires and the classic tropes, but I think I find those things more scary now. Like just these little situations in life. Social media terrifies me. Every time I go somewhere, I'm thinking the same thing. What is the danger lurking in this that is not evident, that everyone thinks it's a great, beautiful thing? Where's that Ferris wheel going to burst into flames? So I really do think that's a great direction to go in for horror.
I think part of it is, because you're saying it freaks you out more now. I think part of that is definitely immersing ourselves in horror 24 hours a day. But I think another part of it is, I think as you get older, you have a clearer grasp of your own mortality. Like as a kid, you think you're invincible, and you'll go on, these rides like, well, just totally like, because you don't really understand that you're gonna die. Maybe not in that moment, but you are gonna die. Like that doesn't really sink in until you get older, and the older you get, the closer you get to being dead. And so you see the potential danger in all these little things that was always there, but you were just as a teenager like, whatever, I'm gonna live forever, And now you're like, no, I'm gonna fucking die, and you see it in little things, in little things. Yeah.
So it may as well be the Ferris wheel.
It may as well be the Ferris wheel. At least it'll be a good story, right? At least it'll be a good story at the funeral. He died doing what he loved, bursting into flames on the Ferris wheel.
That is one thing I do like in newer horror, or I don't want to say newer horror stories, but one thing, like you said, as I get older, I want to read more about that side of it. It's not so much about the characters being killed, but maybe how they face that mortality, how the actual, I don't know, that's the terror in it, knowing that you will die or something like this is going on. I guess maybe that's been my evolution from the let's just bloody rip everything up, which I still, there was a time and place for it. And now this is what I feel more. I want that. Wow. And maybe that's because I'm just older. And I think you're right on that. It's very important, though, to get that story.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Horror readers do not always, I should say many horror readers, don't always like a thriller or a mystery. They seem to be very quickly turned off by it. So I know we know it now, but looking back, when did you first notice that, oh, this is an issue? I can't just randomly put something out because my fans expect something. And then did you develop a plan, or how did that maybe come about? Did you need to rebrand yourself at all or market books differently?
Yeah. That is a good question. It's not so much a thriller or mystery that they say, whereas it's crime. Because I have some books that I would classify as crime, or even like on the threshold of crime meets horror. And I'd noticed, when I would release a book that we advertise as saying, oh, this dark crime thriller, this sick, twisted crime story, no matter what adjectives you used, if there was crime in there, a lot of horror readers would be like, oh, I'm not really into the crime stories. Because, a lot of them, they think it's going to be, cops and robbers type of stuff. And, which legitimately, that's what a lot of crime novels are. And some are just not into it. When we released Fine Evening in Hell, you and I talked about it, because that story is kind of a crime story. It's these criminals and dirty cops and stuff, and this innocent hostage. but the story gets darker and darker and darker as it goes, and by the end of it, you have this almost Jack Ketchum-like, situation that in the third act. And so I said to you, I was like, let's just advertise it as a thriller, because I know horror fans, if they see the word, not all of them, there's plenty of horror fans that love crime, but certain, ones that are a little bit more picky about the things that they pick up would pass on it, even if they liked my other stuff that was horror. They would tell me, oh, just let me know when your next horror one comes out. And I would say, no, trust me, if you read this, it's filled with all of the darkness and the murder and evil that you would get from one of my horror stories. It may not be as bloody, as far as no one's having sex with intestines or anything like you would get from Body Art. That's not in there, but you still have extreme horrible violence and human trafficking, all sorts of shit. Yeah. That's incredibly dark. And in a way, a lot of those stories to me are darker because they're more down to earth. Books like Body Art or The Night Stalkers, although they are horror and they're filled with gore, they're so off the wall that in many ways they're funny, whereas something like Finding Ring Hell, I don't think is funny at all. It's because it's so grounded in reality.
Agreed.
How did you find that they responded to thriller? Because I see a lot of overlap on horror thriller in general.
Yeah. Well, it's hard to say how they react to that. It's really more, it's kind of like trying to find a compromise, because I don't want to advertise a book like that as horror and people will be disappointed because it's not really a horror novel. So thriller was kind of a compromise. It's like, well, it definitely could be a thriller. A thriller is a more broad term than horror or crime. So I think that it helps to add that. I had a book come out last year called "And the Devil Cried," and we even purposely made the cover look like an old pulp, dime store novel. And that book is very much a crime story. It starts with this guy getting out of prison, and then it involves him working with organized crime. But that book might be the most evil thing I've ever written when it comes to the main character and what they do. A lot of people, one of my more popular books is a book called Full Brutal, which is about a psychotic teenage girl and all of the evil things that she does. And they're fucking evil, and people love that book. But I'll tell those readers, you should check out "And the Devil Cried" because it's a similar kind of thing. But they're like, oh, but this is about the mob and this hitman and stuff. I'm like, no, that's not what's important. What's important here is the character themselves and what they do, and what he does is just as evil as the stuff that Kim in Full Brutal does. It's just a different genre of fiction. So
I like that you brought up the cover. We've talked about that before. I think that's so crucial. So maybe a huge tip for authors is think about that book. Maybe it's easier, and I'll ask you what other advice you have for others, but it sounds like it might be easier to market the book as what it is through the cover and being very specific on your word choices and how you, market it then, making sure that you don't call it something that it's not.
Right.
Are there any other tips besides just the description and say the cover that you have? And it sounds like going to the right publisher for something makes sense too. But is there anything else? Because it sounds like that might be easier than trying to rebrand you. And I know, Lucy, you might have talked about pen names, maybe a question on that. So I'm not sure. What other advice, I guess?
Sometimes I've thought maybe I should have done that I should have done a pen name thing. For example, if you're starting off as a writer and you're going to write, really extreme stuff, and you're going to have book titles that are off the wall, like Big-Breasted Chainsaw Hookers or something like that. You have to keep in mind that if you're putting that like something on Godless, if you're putting that title under your own name, anytime you're trying to get a job or a loan or anything else, when they search you, that's gonna pop up. And sure, you didn't do anything wrong, but people like we were saying when you tell people you write horror, people look up your name and you're trying to get a job at McDonald's or whatever, and they see that you write books about insane big-breasted chainsaw prostitutes. They'll look at you a little weird, or maybe that'll help you get the job, depending on the person. But
depends on your manager, I guess. Right?
Yeah. So you want to keep that in mind with using your own name, and then also if you're going to be writing different genres, that's also something to consider. If you're going to be writing extreme horror on the one hand, and then on the other hand, you're going to be writing straight Westerns, not splatter ones or anything, not horror ones, just straight Westerns, you might want to consider using two different names, because you don't want your audience to get confused or angry when they think they're getting one thing and they're getting something else. Third, with that is a bit of advice: is if you're going to do extreme horror, keep in mind that it's kind of like doing porn, in the sense that X is forever. Once you do that, that's what people are going to recognize you for. So if you can go one or two ways with it. Is you could go full in, you go full hog or whatever, and just do nothing but splatter extreme and just build upon that, and you can and rock it. Or if you're wanting to do, say, extreme horror and also do some more conventional horror too, that it isn't just blood and guts, you'll want to keep that like a steady ebb and flow. So that way you wouldn't want to write, say, 5 or 6 extreme horror books and then put out something a little tamer and expect your audience to just roll with that. It's better to kind of have it go back and forth very early on in your publishing. So people learn early on that, okay, this guy isn't just doing blood and guts, he can do this stuff too, or girl, whatever. But some writers got kind of stuck in that, where they became known for a certain thing, and then the only way they could sell books is if they were bringing that same level of gore and extremity and absurdity over and over and over. And I think some people get burnt out writing that, to the end of time. They want to do different things, but then they get stuck. So that's something to keep in mind too.
I like that ebb and flow. That's an important one.
I wanted to ask about the going back and forth between something that is, some books that are very like serious tone, and then throwing out something like Night Stalkers,
Right.
so I thought Night Stalkers was very funny. So
Yes, thank you.
And so, yeah, how did that go over, and how do you manage things like that?
That's a good question, because even when we released Night Stalkers, I deliberately wrote a foreword because I felt like I should for any potential readers, because anyone who read Gone to See the Riverman, which is like my most popular book and is dark and brooding and scary, to go from that to Night Stalkers is such a huge leap, because Night Stalkers is very horror comedy, to an extreme, level. So yeah, I wrote a forward in it saying, hey readers, the first line I think is, dear reader, I owe you an apology. And that was the whole opening, was just saying, hey, this is what you're in for. This is not one of my regular books. This is something that Ryan Harding, the co-author, and I wrote really just for our own laughs. And that's what it was. And when Ryan and I wrote it, I mean, it's a book about a satanic grocery store, so readers should know going into it it's not going to be serious just from that. But when he and I wrote it, we were really just kind of, we came up with the basic idea, and we were like, send stuff back and forth. I would write a few thousand words, send it to him, and then he'd send it back to me with his edits and his words, and giving it all one voice. But really, we were just trying to outdo each other with grossness every time we sent each other something. And we were just trying to make each other laugh. And it was such a fun experience. And then we were just, he and I both had grown up on death metal. So we just filled it with all these death metal references. And it was really just a very fun thing to write. And I think that it could only have worked as a dark comedy. And some people get it, and other people, I think, are just too disgusted by it and outraged by some of the things that happen, which is totally understandable. I'm not going to argue with people when they're like, "Oh, it was funny until that lady got a forced abortion in the produce department." I'm like, yeah, that's understandable that you didn't like that. I understand, but it was really just about making it as intense and as crazy as possible. So
yeah.
That's a good technique, though, because if you write a forward, it really sets the reader up right away. And that's something in today's world that now we almost can always see a preview of like 5% of the book or something. They can learn right away what it is. And it's, you know, it puts in your personality and it lets the reader know. And I think that's a great addition that anyone could do as they navigate genres. And it seems easier than having to do a pen name and build all this stuff up.
Yeah. I think it also helped with that book that it was a collaboration. So it's not like you were just getting, this is a Kristopher Triana novel, you know. It was like, okay, this is a whole other thing. It's me working with another person, and, you know, so I think that helps it separate a little bit too. You know, definitely had more laughs writing that than anything else. But sometimes you just laugh to yourself too when you're writing extreme horror, when you're just like, oh man, people are going to be pissed, you know, like when you write a certain scene and you just start laughing, you're like, oh, people are going to be mad, you know, and it makes you laugh. Or you just try to outdo yourself. That's what I was doing when I wrote Full Brutal, is I just, as the book went on, I just was like, okay, what's the worst possible thing I could do to someone? What's the worst possible thing another human being could do? And it wasn't just like rip out their guts. It's like, no, it's not as simple as that. Like, let's slowly build up to that, and just like ruining a life, ruining a reputation, ruining their family, et cetera, et cetera. And it just kind of escalates. And so that gave me like this, you know, because it's fiction, because it's not real, it gives you this little kind of, you know, laugh to yourself of just like, oh man, I'm just making this worse and worse and worse, and you just kind of like just laughing to yourself at this horrible situation that you're creating for a fictional world. You know? But maybe it's just me. I'm a sick person.
And I laugh at those things too. I do, especially when and then when I read some of your manuscripts, I love writing little notes in them when I'm going through the first time. Like, awesome. I'll just do a little thing. I'm like, I'm laughing. I'll write a comment in it too. It does. It cracks me up. I haven't seen you ever write, but I can see you like in my mind. I'm envisioning you sitting, you know, in your cabin in the woods in the snow, like just laughing about it.
That's a very good description of me. It's just a man in a cabin in the woods just laughing hysterically. Yeah, it's true. That's pretty much my life. Yeah, I'm like this close to being Ted Kaczynski here. You know?
I do like the look, though. I like the look.
Yeah, the beard and everything just made things worse. Yeah.
Asking about pen names, I think it was because perhaps pen names seem to be for someone who's writing for trends, you were saying.
Yeah.
You really want to build an audience.
Yeah, and my thought on that one was kind of like what we covered on the first question of like, you know, that the story determines the genre rather than like, I'm going to set out and write an extreme horror novel. Because I think, I don't know. I think I see that a lot where like you'll see people who are like big fans of the genre, and they're mostly a fan of the genre, and then they'll want to contribute something because they're a fan, so they will write specifically to a genre. And so I see that, and then you see other people who just were like, well, this is the story and it's what it is. Label it as you will. And
right.
And I feel like the pen name and separating it, because, you know, you might go through an extreme horror phase and then you might get, like, as you were saying, get burnt out on it. Like, well, I want to write high fantasy now. And so choosing another pen name because you're getting into exploring all these different genres, as opposed to like, oh, here's the story. I have to tell it in some way. And this one just happens to have a lot of blood and guts, you know?
Right.
Yeah. Well, then that makes me think of a question. Is there any, I'm scared to say high fantasy, but is there anything more like that in you? Is there a genre you haven't tackled yet that you want to because of the story? I guess I shouldn't even say genre, but has a story come to you where you're like, gosh, this would be kind of cool, but shit, it's like fantasy. Is that ever kind of popped in your head, or no?
Well, I've never been into the fantasy genre, like the whole sword and sandal, you know, epics and everything. It's just not for me. So that's not an issue. But I mean, if I think of something that I want to write, if I'm passionate about it, then I'll do it. And that's why I've jumped between, like, you know, I want to write this crime novel, even though it doesn't sell as much as my horror novels. I'm like, I want to write this fucking crime novel that's in my head, and so I do it. You know, I mean, maybe there's like some little bits of things that I've dabbled into, like some of my published short stories some of them have like a sci-fi feel to them, but not in the Star Wars sense of sci-fi, more in the sense of like hard physics and like nerd stuff like that. But people generally don't want to read about that because you have to learn a lot to even get into the story, you know. And I'm not saying that I'm smarter than the reader, because I'm not. I'm an idiot. But I will read an article and get all that information in my mind, and that'll put a story idea in my head, and then I'll want to write the story. But I'm like, oh, but you have to know everything that's in this article for the story to make sense on an astrophysical level.
Yeah.
And so then the story ends up becoming this like textbook too, and it just doesn't work. So maybe maybe there are some stories where I feel like having to explain the science behind it, or having to explain. Well, here's a good example. I'm working right now on a story that takes place in prison, and I've had to learn a great deal about prison life from the CO's point of view, as far as the inmates. And I'm trying to write this story, but at the same time, it's like, okay, don't over-explain prison life just because you've learned so much about it. But at the same time, you've got to put in just enough information that the story will continue to make sense. Because, prison is so different than what any free person has ever experienced. So when you write a story that takes place in a prison, and you see it a lot in the movies, like things happen in the movies where that would never happen in prison because of the way the life is actually regulated. But most people don't know that, so you have to go in, you have to explain, okay, this is the period of time that these people are allowed out of their cells, and this is who has to sit where in the mess hall and all that. So you do run into that issue where you want to explain it without over-explaining it. So I don't know. I think I've once again gone off topic, but
no, that makes a lot of sense, because it's something that maybe, and I don't know if it's just a horror, but I have seen that where there's such hard science in it. You really got to be interested in that. I guess maybe I'm more of like a John Carpenter guy, like Prince of Darkness.
Prince of Darkness, yeah.
Talking about all of like, it has something to do with astrophysics.
Oh yeah, they're talking about the whole movie is based in like, what if astrophysics is tied into the supernatural and the devil and everything. Yeah, I love that.
I love to see.
Yeah,
but we don't always.
But that movie was a huge fucking bomb for him. Because people were like, what the fuck is this? There's like this green liquid, and that's the devil, and their team of physicists. It just did not work for people. They were like, no, I want Michael Myers. And
that's nice, because like I love that one, and I know you're a big fan of that one.
Absolutely.
Too. But I guess that's the best way I've seen that I can give an example that maybe everyone has seen. Hopefully, if they're horror fans watching this, but I find that we tend to cut out, again, stereotypical across the board maybe, but not everyone. We cut out a lot of that science stuff or a lot of the explanation in favor of the story, whereas you do a lot of research and you keep it in, and it really does enhance it. And I'm not sure if there's a right or wrong way. Sometimes I do. I try to glaze over it myself, just give them enough, because I might not know it myself, and I should probably be doing more research like you do. And that really brings the story alive. I think it does. It makes it maybe more accessible to more people than just horror fans, and like, oh, he's actually done something and done some research here.
Yeah, I definitely do. And I know sometimes that can be annoying for my publisher when I go in last minute changes and be like, wait a minute, there's this one thing. There's one thing they changed at this actual prison recently, so we need to change it. Like I did.
Bastard's got something on conjugal visits that we got.
Yep. Yeah, I was like, no, wait. Federal versus state and all this stuff. Like, yeah. So there's a lot of differences. Yeah, a lot of differences. But no, I want to be as accurate as possible. I mean, when I wrote my Western, that was like the accumulation of decades of reading actual Westerns, not just horror Westerns, but Westerns written by Western authors that specialize in it, historians, and also just having kind of a general interest in that era in time, of the 1800s. And so I brought to that splatter Western, even though it's fantastical, it's about werewolves and it's filled with carnage. It's historically accurate as far as the guns used, the technology used, the politics of the time. It is accurate. A lot of times I'll see, horror writers try to do a horror Western, and it's clear that they've only watched like Clint Eastwood movies. They all have this formula. It's like, oh, okay, the main character is always a gunslinger. And all the female characters are prostitutes, every single one. Apparently, there were no school teachers in the Wild West. They were all whores and gunslingers, all of them.
Oh, what an age to live in!
Yeah. So I wanted to combat that, so I had several in mind. Like not there are no like there's a saloon girl, which is not the same as a prostitute. That's a character, but other than that, like the characters, there's a school teacher, there's a nun, there's a young girl who works on a farm. I was like, I'm not having all of my female characters be whores. That's ridiculous. That's just like a movie trope for westerns, you know. But I put whores in the sequel that comes out later.
Oh, good.
But they're werewolf whores, so you know they're a little
different, very different. I think. Sorry, werewolf whores totally took me off of where I was going to go next with.
Why would it? Why would that derail things? Werewolf whores. It's a romance. It's a romance.
I think that also helps in moving across genres, the fact that you can do other characters. But I wanted to come back, and this is a guy. I'm glad you brought up that Prince of Darkness was a total flop for John Carpenter, because as you were over last time hanging out and we were chatting, you reminded me that John Carpenter's Big Trouble in Little China is actually a Western.
It totally is.
It's totally a Western movie. And I always forget that. And then somebody brings up like, well, hell yeah, it is. He seems to be, and this is important you brought it up, but a guy who, he's a horror guy, and yet he does Westerns. He does fantasy. He's doing astrophysics and sci-fi. He's doing it all, but he's always John Carpenter. He is kind of like, I guess, the director equivalent of the kind of authors that I really like to see moving around.
Yeah, I he's one of my absolute idols as a horror creator, and I've always loved that he's had that variety to him, where he could make a movie like Halloween and then also make a movie like Escape from New York, you know, which are just very, very both dark and nihilistic, but very different tone, very different genre, and then even do comedic stuff. Like the thing that I love about Big Trouble in Little China is it's every movie genre in one movie. It's a martial arts movie, it's a comedy, it's a horror movie, it's monsters and kung fu, and it's funny. It's everything, you know, and it's a Western in a story structure. Of course, it doesn't take place in the Wild West, but you've got a stranger coming into town where there's trouble brewing, where there's an old evil there, and he has to come in and save the day. And he even talks like John Wayne. They did that on purpose, you know. He's like, "Hey, little lady," like Jack Wayne talks like that, you know, on purpose. And then in Escape from New York, Russell talks like Clint Eastwood, you know, when he does the Snake Plissken voice, you know, and that whisper, you know. So Carpenter definitely was a big Western fan. He didn't necessarily do a Western. I mean, Vampires kind of feels like a Western when you watch it too, but he was a big fan, particularly of Once Upon a Time in the West, which is my favorite Western.
Harmonica.
Yeah, man. Carpenter absolutely loved that movie. He's gone on record saying many times how big of an influence Leone's stuff was, particularly that movie. And funny enough, another horror icon, a lot of people forget this or don't realize this, Dario Argento co-wrote the screenplay to that movie. And a lot of people forget that or don't notice that, but yeah, before he became a director himself and became a horror icon with Suspiria and Deep Red and stuff like that, he was a screenwriter and he co-wrote Once Upon a Time in the West. So there's another thing for these horror fans out there who are like, oh, I don't really like crime. It's like it's that same type of thing. It's like no, trust me. Like a lot of these creators that you love, these filmmakers, these writers, they have these other projects that will give you that same vibe that you liked of their work. Maybe it's not horror, but it gives you that same dark vibe, because horror can exist in any genre and any time, you know. Like you could have, like, look at you mentioned fantasy, look at like Game of Thrones, you know, that's like a sword and sandal thing, but it's filled with horror and carnage, you know. So
yeah Oh, absolutely. And this is a silly question because I pretty much already know the answer, but you read outside of horror, then you read a lot of it. I know we've watched a ton of movies that are outside of it, but what are some of your favorite genres to read outside of horror?
Western and crime, probably the ones that I go after the most. I've always liked those two genres a lot. And some of my favorite writers write in there, Cormac McCarthy and Elmore Leonard, Jim Thompson. I read a lot of the classic stuff. I also like to go back a lot and read, and this is something I think all young writers should do, is go back and read writers' horror novels from 20, 30, 40 years ago that you haven't heard of. Of course you read King, of course you read Barker and all that, but go back and find like the Charles L. Grants and you know, writers like that have been kind of forgotten to time. But 30, 40 years ago, they were kings of the genre, you know. So I go back and I read a lot of those, and I think it's important to do that. I also think that it's important for writers to read stuff that would be the opposite of what they would normally read or write. One of the things that's helped me, and I've had people comment, which is a great compliment, people say, "Oh, you write women very well. How do you write women so well?" I said, "Well, I read a ton of stuff written by women. That's the way to do it." You know, it's like, and you know, like what better way to get into the female psyche, you know, than to read these books written from a female perspective? Because I think a lot of writers, they just go after like so someone will be like, "Oh man, I love Stephen King. I want to be like Stephen King," and they'll just like focus on Stephen King, and then others that are like him, like Dean Koontz and stuff like that. It's like, no, read all this stuff that's completely out of your world. Read Toni Morrison, you know, like read stuff that you wouldn't normally think that you were aspiring to be like, because you're learning writing technique and writing style and tone and character from a wider perspective. Then you're not just pigeonholing yourself into this one little pocket of horror, you know.
Absolutely. That's a good one. Now this final one doesn't even have to be about the genre switching or anything, because I love that what you said for newer writers. Is there any other little tidbits of information like that you want to share with a young writer starting out, who's maybe in their first or second year of publishing, that you could help them navigate an obstacle that you've already gone through maybe?
Yeah, I always try to help out young authors and aspiring authors, you know, because I had a couple of people that have stepped in and that have been around longer than me that have helped me, and it means the world, and we should all be a community that helps each other. So my advice, if you're just starting out, is to not quit. You will get rejected many times. So don't quit, but also don't ignore the criticism at the same time. You know, you want to be open to constructive criticism. If someone's like, "This sucks," that's not constructive, and you can tell them to fuck off. But if someone's like, "Well, you got a decent idea here, but here's the problems with it," you should be open to that. You know, don't think that never think that your first draft or second draft is a masterpiece, because I promise you it's not. And not because you're you, it's because you're a person, and that's just how it works. You're going to continue to grow as an author, and you're going to continue to perfect your craft. It's something that never stops. You don't get to a point where you're like, "Well, I'm done. I'm perfect now." No, you're always, to the day you die. I don't care what writer you are. You're continuing to change and perfect your craft and learn things from other writers. But at the same time, once you start putting books out and everything, I mean, it's good to get that constructive criticism, but don't pay too much attention to reviews. Reviewers are great and wonderful. They've helped, you know, my career. They helped a lot of people's careers. But I'm saying, as a writer, you don't want to obsess over the reviews that you're getting, because it can change like your perspective on your own writing. I can give, even if it's all good, if someone just loves one particular book, you're like, then you start to get this anxiety of like, "Oh, I've got to live up to this book that I wrote," you know. So you want to be careful with that. Always write for the people who like your stuff, and don't write for the people who don't like your stuff. You know, don't try to change your style because someone said that someone hated your book and like, "Well, okay, I'll do better next time." No, they're just not your audience. They're just not your audience. Write for the people, you know. If they're like, "Hey, I loved these 4 books of yours," keep doing that. Keep putting that stuff out. You know? So that's just some of the stuff that comes to mind.
Perfect. And I just wanted to reiterate one more time that awesome suggestion you had earlier for authors, that ebb and flow if they're just starting out, not just putting out extreme horror unless that's what they really think they want to do for a long period of time. I think we know as we get older, it's not always what you want to do forever, but that putting it out is really important. One last one then, I guess, for you. That first draft, and you write very quickly, but that first draft, how long do you sometimes set it aside for? Because I've done the same thing. I have to circle back through, and sometimes what I get at the end is much different than that first draft. Sure. And so how long do you set it aside and then go work on something else normally?
Yeah, usually, you know, usually if I write, say, if I write a novel, for example, it takes me, a couple of months to write the novel. And then when I'm done with it, while it's still all in my head, I go through and I do a full round of edits, and then I just let it sit. And the amount of time I let it sit is really more based on, not on time, but on other projects, because letting it sit doesn't mean just this, leaving it and then waiting. It's really getting your head out of that world. So, I'll say I wrote the novel, and then I'm like, okay, I've got 4, and then I write 4 short stories and a novella afterwards, and then I'm completely in those worlds, and I finish that. And then say that takes me, 2 or 3 months or something, and then I'll go back, to the novel, and then I've forgotten it, because that's a big thing with editing is it's what it's supposed to say, what it's supposed to feel like when you're writing it, but you need to make sure that you're translating that for the reader appropriately. So it's always good to go back, and this has happened to me several times, and I think it's one of the blessings of getting forgetful is I'll go back to something that I wrote 3 months ago, and I'll be like, I don't remember half of the shit that's happened in the book, and so I'm surprised myself. I'm like, oh yeah, I forgot I wrote that. I forgot this character that this happens to them, and it makes the editing better in that sense, because you completely have blacked out on. At least I have, because my memory is going. Because I don't know.
Definitely done the same thing. Definitely.
Yeah, you leave it alone
yourself all the time.
Yeah, you leave something alone long enough, and then even though it was a big part of your life for 2 or 3 months, but then you go for several months creating whole other worlds, and you forget it. It's the same thing when like when you read someone else's book. There's so many books that I have in my library where people come over and go, oh, look, this one looks good. And I'll be like, yeah, that's one of my favorite books of all time. I love that book. It rules. And what's it about? I don't know. Yeah, because I can't remember. I just remember that I read it, and I get like vague ideas. Like, it's dark, and this woman kills this guy and steals his son, or something like that. It's like very vague. Like what? Because it's been 20 fucking years since I read the book, so I don't remember everything. It's not like rereading a book is a big time commitment. It's not like rewatching a movie, But even that, with the fucking movies now, I'll watch a movie, and then, a year later, people tell me, I saw this great movie, and they'll tell me all about it. I'm like, that sounds awesome. And I'll go and I'll rent it, I'll put it on, I'm halfway through it, I'm like, oh, I saw this. And I liked it, and I fucking liked it, too. It's not even like oh, I forgot about it because it was crap. It's like, no, this was really good, I forgot. And also, I think also as a creator, you're constantly, at least I am, I'm sure you guys too, constantly just taking in books and movies and stories, just and coming up with your own. So there's all these worlds that just are swirling in your head that have nothing to do with reality. It's all these phantom worlds of the mind, and so they just your brain can only hold so much, I think.
Yeah.
But it's funny what you retain, like the stuff from when you were younger. Like I could probably recite Big Trouble in Little China from memory, like line for line, because I've seen it so many times. But then, a movie that I watched a week ago, I can't tell you everything that happens in it. Yeah.
So authors, you've got some great tips going on in here. Something about that, the continuous cycle. Think about that. It's continuing. So just because one book gets put aside and it has to sit while you jump into another world, it's okay. You're perpetually working and moving on to something new. And I guess that goes to one thing that I always like to say is that success is usually a game of patience. Perseverance more than anything. I think, and this is 10 years ago, it was 2012, that's when I read The Devouring. And I don't think success it can happen overnight, right? But people might not realize that. They might see this body of work and think that Chris was always as prolific as he is today. And it took a long time, and all this, but never stopped. And he was always doing the cycling process and always learning more and evolving as a writer. And so he also has a plan. So don't just put out your first book, make a plan, think about it. Don't just be the most extreme person in the world. And thank you again so much for joining, Chris.
Thank you guys. Yeah.
Thank you.
No, I love it. And I'm really excited to see the stuff that you guys are putting out too. So thank you for having me on the show. I appreciate it. It's a good show.